I'm very pleased to welcome you to the inaugural presentation in our series on trust in education. My name is Sheila Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, and on behalf of our General Manager, Chris Stover, and the Chair of our Board, Bill Black, I'm very pleased to have you all here this evening for what I know will be a stimulating and interesting session. CCEPA, for those of you who are not familiar with its history, is a joint initiative of St. Mary's University and the Atlantic School of Theology. Started in 2002 and really got the wind in its sails 3 years ago. And we are continuing on with our commitment to public presentations, such as this evening's session, to providing a forum for discussion on ethical matters in public affairs, to supporting research in this field, and to offering consultation services where people want to build ethics and values into their operations more explicitly. As I said, this is the inaugural presentation in a series of sessions on trust in education, and we invite you to attend the series, not just this evening. The second one will be on March the 11th, at the same time, 7 p.m., same place, in the theatre here at St. Mary's University. And the presenter will be Sir John Daniel, who is currently the head of the Commonwealth of Learning. Session 3 in the series, we're reaching out to a different audience. We are organising a high school debate where students from 6 different schools will come to debate some of the issues we'll be talking about in this series. We haven't quite finalised the details of that. And the arc of lectures will conclude on April 16th, when Dr. Bernard Shapiro will be here, and we will finish up that evening with a capstone panel with 3 distinguished commentators. Should you not be able to make all the sessions in the series, we have asked David Napier, a story-based consultant, to attend each session and provide a summary which will be available on our website, and we'll weave together the threads of the various sessions in the series to provide some continuity and keep everybody up to date. And at each subsequent session, David will provide a recap of the previous session so that no one need feel that they're missing anything if they didn't come, if they weren't able to get to all the sessions, although of course we would like you to be here in person, but David's role is to provide continuity and, as I say, weave the threads of the story together. Since this is the last time I plan to be on my feet this evening until after the session, I'd just like to draw your attention to the fact there is an evaluation form on the desk in front of you, and we very much appreciate your feedback. It helps us plan for future events. I'd like to extend our appreciation to St. Mary's University for the use of this facility, which is of course ideal for our circumstances, and I would invite you also to join us in the foyer afterwards for some refreshments and to meet our speaker personally. The rest of the evening will be chaired by Alan Shaw. Alan is a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, and it's my pleasure to ask Alan to come to the podium and direct the rest of the evening's proceedings. Please join me in welcoming Alan Shaw to the podium.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you all for being here. I am very excited about this series that a number of people have been working on for some months now. It's my job and my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight's presentation, part 1 of a 4-part Trust in Education series. He's Dr. Paul Cappon, the President and CEO of the Canadian Council on Learning. As a prominent educator, a medical doctor, and an administrator, Paul has been an advocate of lifelong learning, a community supporter, and an author of numerous publications on learning and community medicine. He has earned degrees in several fields, including a PhD in sociology from the Université de Paris, a medical degree from McMaster, and a family medicine specialization from Dalhousie here in Halifax. Since the 90s, Paul has built a remarkable public service career. He's been a faculty member at several Canadian universities, including Laurentian, McGill, St. Mary's, and UBC, teaching both sociology and medicine. Most recently, he served as the Director General of the Council of Ministers of Education in Canada. In addition to his contributions in the academic world, Paul served, among other roles, as Director of AIDS Studies at the Montreal General Hospital. He's a member of the International Coordinating Council at the State of the World Forum and acts as chair of the Policy Action Group on Learning for the Commission on Globalization. In 2002, Dr. Cappon received the commemorative Queen Elizabeth II Golden Jubilee Medal for his significant contribution to his profession. He is fluent in French and English, and I understand has a working knowledge of Italian and German. So tonight, in part one of our series on education, we ask, is our education system doing what it's supposed to? Does it educate students to do, to be, and to know? I can't think of too many people better equipped to answer these and many other questions about the conditions of learning. Paul believes investment in human capital will distinguish successful societies from their competitors. Our investment begins right now. I give you Dr. Paul Cappon.
Good evening. It is indeed a pleasure to be back in Halifax. Many connections to the city, as Alan was mentioning, and I thank Alan very much for that generous introduction. Many connections to the city, including the fact that I have a son who was born here, and we had 4 marvelous years here between 1980 and 1984. The last time I spoke at St. Mary's, this was the one place where I did some courses, but wasn't a full-time faculty member. I was adjunct, given that I was busy with medicine at the time. And when Alan Shaw and Frank Schwartz and I first discussed his lecture series, Frank Schwartz and I realized that we'd attended McGill University together some 4 decades ago. Sometimes it really is a small world. I am grateful that the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs and I think the Learning Partnership invited me to join you here tonight, and grateful for the important work that they do, in fact, to shape our society for the better. You know what the Centre does, and the Learning Partnership, which is dedicated to strengthening public education, is in fact headed by Veronica Lacey. My own organization is fortunate to have Veronica as vice chair of our board. In response to this question about trust in education, I must convey a sense of the complexity of the issues involving learning. A lot of people think that because they went to school, education is only a matter of common sense. People don't say that about medicine, I've noticed, but they do say that about education. But when in fact, these are not simple commonsensical answers and questions. As Shakespeare declared, if to do were as easy as to know what to do, then chapels would be churches, and poor men's cottages would be castles. We know what we must do in terms of education, and that is put the learner first, personalize his or her intellectual and spiritual growth through the learning process. That's what we should do. The question about how to do it is another thing. But this concern, the learner focus, takes precedence in my mind over the convenience of administrators, of institutions, of educators, and of governments. Now, when I attend public lectures, especially about broad subjects like tonight's example, I like to make a rapid decision about whether I should remain in my seat for the duration, or else take advantage of a pause and find my way to the nearest pub where I can comfortably await reports on the lecture. Generally, the optimal means of making that choice is to divine what the gist is of what the speaker is going to say. If I agree with the themes, well, then there's no point in hearing the details, is there? And if I do not agree, I probably don't want to hear it anymore from that fellow anyway, so you have an option in either case. But I do like to make it easy, actually, for an audience to relate from the outset the core points so that you can find interest and pleasure, perhaps, in the next 40 minutes in poking holes in all of my subsequent arguments. So here are the three salient points I'd like to make this evening. First, trust in education must be measured with regard to performance, not just of schools, but also more broadly, with respect to society's success in promoting opportunities for continuous learning. Second, accountability and transparency will improve and promote trust regardless of the level of performance of education systems at any particular point in time. They are of value in and of themselves, provided, of course, that continuous improvement is a declared objective of that education system. Accountability and transparency do not emerge spontaneously. They must be nurtured. We must create the conditions, voices, bodies that support them. And third, the last main point, the challenge of learning is much broader than school systems, much deeper than provision of formal education. It involves the partly unconscious, but mainly the conscious and planned adaptation of a geographical and economic entity to the conditions and imperatives of a knowledge society. So a key underlying question is learning for what? I hope to pique your interest in the role of learning in realizing the whole person and in developing and strengthening democratic values through active and engaged citizenship. With these goals in mind and these three salient points I want to make, I want to reference two major international developments within the last generation, I would say, that have altered the landscape for learning in Canada fundamentally. The first, of course, is the growing dialogue on lifelong learning. Formal education is not an end unto itself. The public education system is part of a continuum of learning that runs throughout life. The second development is the global decline of trust in institutions, including educational institutions. People's trust, I think, depends in part upon the quality and upon the relevance of the information they are given, but also upon accountability achieved through transparency of reporting, analysis, and evaluation of results. I think that the growth in lifelong learning and the decline in trust are not necessarily separate issues. Enhancing trust in schools is central to meeting the shared community opportunities and responsibilities of lifelong learning. A crucial way to boost confidence, streamline school goals, and inculcate lifelong learning is to focus on developing the capacity for critical thinking beginning at an early age, and I'll come to this point about critical thinking a little later on. First, perhaps a few words about the Canadian Council on Learning so that you'll know a little more about the genesis of my approach to the question that I'm asked to treat tonight. The Canadian Council on Learning seeks to be an authoritative resource in monitoring, analyzing, evaluating, and reporting on the progress of learning in Canada, providing leadership through a thorough and, we hope, thoughtful approach to lifelong learning, quality research, knowledge exchange, all with the goal of enabling what we call evidence-informed decisions. The Council endeavours to improve learning outcomes for Canadians and foster the growth of a vibrant pan-Canadian learning culture. Our approach is akin, if I can strike this metaphor, to a social movement for learning rather than just a think tank. The metaphor I like is to link Canadians like the train did in the 19th century from coast to coast, because the learning ethic is one that Canadians share. It crosses regions, it crosses generations, it crosses languages, it crosses ethnicities. It is a truly linking national project. Therefore, the train metaphor is one that I like to use. So that's the background with respect to CCL that takes me to the question, learning for what? A simple answer to the question, learning for what, might be learning for social and economic well-being. On the personal level, it's well known. Learning benefits Canadians by providing opportunities for higher incomes, better job prospects, improved health, longer lives, and greater potential to pursue their dreams. On the national level, Canada gains through a stronger economy, competitive advantages, greater social stability, cultural vibrancy, and firmer bonds between and within communities. Learning galvanizes the growth of the whole person, mind, body, and spirit. It endows us with reasoning and judgment. It nurtures social and interpersonal skills. It encourages decision-making, teamwork, and leadership skills. So we look for learning to advance knowledge, skills, and values throughout all stages of life. We learn to provide for smoother transitions through these ages and stages of lives. Learning for what, then, is also answered by, the answer is learning for active local, national, and international citizenship on key national and international issues. We learn for knowledge and appreciation of Canadian history and culture, and for support of Canadian identity. As so many young Canadians eagerly point out, we learn for knowledge and appreciation of the natural world and the environment. Learning must encompass the wherewithal to function effectively in the world, and that means literacy, it means reasoning skills, general knowledge, and preparation for occupational success. It must foster the ability to solve problems and to engage in discovery of the world around us, as well as in self-discovery. So when we ask the question then about trust in education, we're asking a very broad question that goes beyond education in the classroom. Lifelong learning then is life-wide and life-broad, fundamental to our experience of being human, and shapes virtually every aspect of our lives. There is, as I said before, an expanding individual and societal commitment to lifelong learning. This principle of lifelong learning was first articulated and taken up as a central organizing idea by UNESCO in 1972 with the publication of the Ford Commission report. That report strengthened and stressed the importance of the concept in relation to the advancement of a learning society. It argued that only lifelong learning comprehensively can produce the kind of person needed by a modern society. In 1996, under the leadership of former European Commission President Jacques Delors, UNESCO proposed building on the four pillars that are the foundation of learning. The four pillars, and Alan referred to at least three of them in the introduction, are learning to know, that is, developing such skills as literacy, concentration, memory, and the ability to reason. Learning to know is often what we refer to when we talk about education. But that's only one of the four pillars, the formal education system, the mastery of knowledge. There's also learning to do, which is the acquisition of applied skills, most often closely tied to occupational success, of the kind that we're most interested in, obviously, in an economy in a downturn. The third pillar is learning to live together, which is community and interpersonal learning, including the cultivation of respect and concern for others. That's not an academic or theoretical pursuit, because that helps to create the conditions for learning in a community that are so important to actual personal and individual development and learning patterns. And finally, learning to be. Last but not least, certainly, because it is the pursuing fulfillment of the person individually, including creativity and health in the physical, social, and spiritual senses. It's the personal development. When CCL did its first review of Canadian people's attitudes towards learning, I was a bit surprised to find that school ranked only third as a source for learning among Canadians. The first source of learning among Canadians was individual reading, part of the learning to be pillar of learning. As a way of examining and reflecting the full spectrum of learning in Canada, we created the annual Composite Learning Index in 2006, which is now in its fourth year. This index is the first of its kind in the world. It's inspired by the UNESCO four pillars of learning. The index paints a picture of the learning conditions at a community level as well as at national level that are associated with social and economic well-being. So in attempting to, in part, to answer the question about trust in education in Canada, we have first to see what we have concluded at CCL about progress in learning more broadly in Canada. So I'll go through the four pillars and give you some portraits, some sense as to what we think we've learned about our accomplishments and therefore the trust that we may have in learning systems in Canada. Beginning in the first years of life, in childhood, obviously learning there has implications for well-being and success in life. During this period, babies and toddlers develop attitudes that will influence their desire and capacity to learn throughout their lives. A snippet of information then, despite this importance that's well recognized, we find that 25% of our children enter school without the requisite foundation for acquiring literacy and numeracy skills. So 1 child in 4 enters grade 1 in this country with learning or behavioral problems. It is true that parents and other family members play the instrumental role in shaping the attitudes and learning capacities of young children. It's also true that any environment children experience can profoundly affect long-term learning success. In this respect, I believe that the long-term effect of early childhood development and learning may not actually be evident through school success, but that its effects become patent later in life. That may explain in part the discrepancy between the relatively good international results of Canadian high school students, on the one hand, and the relatively impoverished systems of early childhood learning in most parts of this country, on the other hand. And I think this point demonstrates that the centerpiece of transparency is not mainly about trust in schools, but I think about our capacity to act collectively and individually on the evidence about learning, in this case the evidence about early childhood learning, and the factors that influence it, such as early childhood development. We know this about early childhood development, but we're not acting on it as a country, as a society. During elementary and secondary school years, the performance of students in mathematics, reading, science, and problem solving is another strong predictor of success in life. Doing well in these disciplines is a forerunner, I would say, of post-secondary educational achievement, also of active involvement in the community and the development of a set of transferable skills. And here, in this regard, Canadian students rank well in international comparisons, as demonstrated through the Program for International Student Assessment. That these relatively positive results for Canadian high school students come as a surprise to most Canadians who are aware of them, and not many Canadians are, I think speaks volumes about levels of trust in education in this country, especially when one considers the disbelief that often accompanies publication of these outcomes. I remember when I did a national press conference at the Council of Ministers of Education when the first PISA results were announced, and whereas other countries had responses depending on the success levels of their students, which were positive when the results were positive, the general reaction in Canada was, this is not likely to be true, because our kids did too well. So the trust clearly was not there in our case. I think lack of trust as impediment to progress and to decentralization to local levels of education and school leadership that might be responsive to local concerns and realities doesn't take place when the trust is not there. Another issue with respect to secondary school, elementary and secondary school, is of course high school dropout rates. In Canada, those rates have decreased by almost 50% since 1991, but those rates are very high, relatively high for teenage boys, for Aboriginal youth, and for youth living in small towns and rural communities. Canada's rate, I'm going through some of the issues with respect to learning to know here. Canada's post-secondary education participation rate ranks high compared to other countries. Canada ranks second out of 20 OECD countries in overall post-secondary education attainment, which includes university, college, and apprenticeships. But there are gaps, significant gaps between rural and urban dwellers, between persons of Aboriginal ancestry and non-Aboriginal persons, and between men and women. The gap between men and women is very striking, and I don't think we can afford political correctness on this issue. At the present time, 61% of university graduates are women, as against 39% men. Whereas just a decade ago, the proportions were equal between men and women. And yet, apprenticeships, which are dominated by men, 90% of apprentices are men, those people are not completing their apprenticeships. So there's a huge human capital question about where the men have gone in Canadian society. It's an awkward question to ask because when you ask it, you could be accused of being anti-feminist, since the concern is about male students and male success. But it reminds me of you can make enemies, is what I'm saying. When you tackle this question, it reminds me of a story about Machiavelli and his tendency not to want to make enemies. Machiavelli was on his deathbed, and because he was an important personage, it was a cardinal, he came to administer the last rites. And the cardinal leans close over Machiavelli on his deathbed and says, "Do you now renounce Satan and all his works?" And he didn't get anything, even like a whisper back, just a little batting of the eyelashes by Machiavelli. So he leaned lower to Machiavelli and said, "Do you renounce Satan and all his works?" And Machiavelli was able to whisper a response, "This is not the time to make new enemies." So that's how I sometimes feel about this particular issue, but I thought I should raise it anyway. With respect to Canada, coming back to Canada, interesting, at the end of October last year, a study by the Conference Board of Canada concluded that Canada ranks second among 17 peer countries on education results. But the board also stated, and I quote, "Canada has been delivering a high-quality education to people between the ages of 5 and 25. But it'll have a different conclusion about other aspects of Canadian learning that I'll come to in a minute. Under learning to do, skills acquisition, obviously beyond formal schooling, we need things like workplace training. And we do need to learn how to do things. Mark Twain had a lovely aphorism for that. Mark Twain used to say, "Never learn how to do anything, because if you don't learn, someone else will come and do it for you." And that might have been true in the late 19th century, but if we do it now, somebody else will eat our lunch. So we do need to pay a lot of attention to learning to do, to skills acquisition. The fact is that in Canada, there's only minimal growth in the proportion of Canadian employers making training available. We are near the bottom of the OECD in workplace education and training. One measurement in particular I'd like to highlight: more than half of workers with a university degree in Canada take some form of job-related training annually, but the number is only about 2 out of 10 for workers with high school diploma or less. That's not good on the face of it, but it's even more problematic than at first glance, because when they do participate, less educated workers are twice as likely as other participants to report that the training helped them move ahead in the job market. In sum, those who need the training receive it the least. Just think about the implications of that for the current economy, where we need workers who are adaptable and whose skills are transferable. That doesn't augur well for a capacity to move out of it. And here I want to add the words of the Conference Board to our own findings at CCL. Quote, "The Canadian system is heavily weighted towards school-acquired skills. It lacks focus on work-based skills training and lifelong education that can be fostered outside traditional academic institutions. Canadian employers are notably low investors in workplace training programs." My view, and this could be disputed, and we could talk about this later if you wish, is that the three principal weaknesses of Canadian learning systems are early childhood learning, workplace education and training, and poor community learning resources and community-based learning, in part due to the American style of urban development, which makes it very difficult to concentrate community-based learning resources in one place. Moving on to the third pillar, learning to live together. Our index, the Composite Learning Index, brings into focus results which I think are particularly apt, since they're about building and understanding and trust. This particular index examines the level of involvement of Canadians in social clubs and other organized groups, which, despite reports to the contrary, by the way, seems to be on the rebound. This includes associations such as Rotary, alumni associations, political parties, and hobby groups. We are in a linguistically diverse country as a consequence of immigration, and surveys show that Canadians are learning from that diversity. Despite linguistic differences, we get along with each other. More than 70% of Canadians socialize with people from other cultures on a regular basis. Over 95% agree that getting together with people from diverse cultures helps to foster learning. And by looking at the level of Canadians who volunteer, we get a sense of community and social engagement. Approximately half of Canadians over the age of 15 volunteer in one of three types of organizations: sports and recreation, social services, and religious groups. Some 4/5 of Canadians offer voluntary support directly to fellow Canadians. Analysis shows that we intuitively sense that volunteering is a learning experience. Volunteers increase their own interpersonal and communication skills and their overall knowledge of a wide range of subjects. So you can see how that is an important component of the learning conditions of a community. And finally, learning to be. Through the Composite Learning Index, we examined some indicators of personal fulfillment and well-being. Media in the home, the use of the printed word, although that's on the decrease, is still, as I mentioned, an important source of learning for Canadians. The rise of household internet spending, which has been dramatic. All of these things are important in terms of understanding and quantifying, which is what we do, this pillar of lifelong learning. I mentioned sports a moment ago. It will not surprise anyone, I think, from the home of the Huskies, that taking part in sports offers personal growth in leadership, teamwork, self-discipline, and creative decision-making. All that on top of the clear physical and social benefits. That's why we take account of this in quantifying learning. Sad truth about this aspect, however, is that only 28% of Canadian adults participate in sports, which is a stunning drop from the 45% we had in the early 1990s. Young adults are opting out of sports in major numbers. Learning through culture also has a positive effect on personal development, including self-confidence and self-esteem. Canadians are moderately increasing their household expenditures on performing arts, while their spending on other cultural events and institutions is static. We monitor all of these as measures in the Composite Learning Index because, taken together, they represent the conditions of learning. In putting together this index, we apply these indicators to 4,700 communities throughout the country. You'll perhaps be particularly interested to know that Atlantic Canadian communities have been leading the country with respect to improvement in learning conditions, although they began at a lower level on the benchmark and had ground to make up. But over the past 3 years, more than 90% of communities in Atlantic Canada have raised their scores over the benchmark set by the first report 3 years ago. We'll be on our fourth report this May. So this portrait of learning that I've just adumbrated is a decidedly mixed one for Canada. Does that imply, and I wanted to give you some sense as to where I thought we were overall before answering the question about trust, because does that imply this mixed picture that we should have more or less trust in our education systems? My answer is that current performance will not per se build or reduce trust. If the right information is gathered, or if the right information is not gathered, not synthesized, not evaluated, not disseminated clearly and widely by any institution, there will be disbelief. Trust is always lacking when Canadians are insufficiently informed. And when that happens, when there's insufficient trust, you can't get the kind of empowerment of local schools, the kind of decentralization you need. You can't get people to take initiatives at the local level. If the public does not believe that they are getting transparent information, sufficient information about performance, they won't agree to decentralize authority to the local level and allow people at that level to take on added responsibilities. I found that in Canadian jurisdictions, and I know them well, having spent 8 years as the Director General of the Council of Ministers, those provinces which are better at reporting and accountability are the provinces which are enabled to decentralize authority to local level in order to deal with local concerns and issues. And those in which the trust is lower, there's centralization of power because there's not trust on the part of the general public in the reporting. What we try to do, this is relevant to what we do at the Council, obviously, because through the Learning Index and our other work, we try to contribute to an increasing public awareness, and through public awareness to public trust. The attitude is, or my attitude is, that whatever the results, transparent reporting leads to greater trust. Prominent examples for which CCL aims to improve transparency and public understanding, and therefore trust and support, are our regular reports on post-secondary education in Canada, the third of which in annual report form will be released next Tuesday on the 17th of February. We try to answer the question, to what extent is the sector, the post-secondary sector, contributing to Canada's social and economic goals. We try to do the same in Aboriginal learning. There, our goal is to reconcile Aboriginal and European ways of looking at learning in a way that's quantifiable and results in transparent reporting of results that are acceptable throughout society. We do something similar with respect to adult literacy. We're reporting regularly on Canadian levels of adult literacy without a lot of anxiety about whether people will find that these are good results or bad results. These are just results. We declare no crisis, but nor do we gloss over intractable or difficult issues. I don't think you can do that if you're trying to elicit trust in any system. We present reliable information, I think, and contrast Canada with others through international comparisons, particularly with members of the developed country grouped under the OECD. In 2007, the Canadian Education Association conducted a survey of public attitudes towards education in Canada, and they say only 6% of Canadians graded their schools an A, 42% a B, and 33% a C. The Canadian Education Association concluded that Canadians' level of confidence in education has fallen sharply. The results are remarkably similar across Canada, with a notable exception of Quebec, where trust in public education is higher. In August 2008, Environics conducted an education issues survey for the CBC, and the general results there are in accord with the findings of the Canadian Education Association, a fairly low level of confidence. CBC also asked questions about what students should be learning in school. And by huge margins, more than 90% in all cases, parents think that children should learn how to cook a meal, manage a household budget, understand nutrition well beyond basic subjects. By equally overwhelming numbers, parents believe schools should stress moral development, values, and ethical behavior, skills that will be useful in future careers. Over 99% of parents think that schools should emphasize social skills, the ability to get along and work with others, all in addition to core subjects like maths, sciences, reading, Canadian history, and civics. That adds up to a daunting set of expectations for our schools today. Our own CCL survey of Canadian attitudes towards structured learning found that the majority of parents are actually quite satisfied with the education system, but they think schools should do more to prepare their children for the realities of the workplace. Our results show that parents are feeling the need to take action, to be actively involved in directing their children's education. Our indicators point to what we're calling intensive parenting, that is reflecting an awareness of the rising demand for skills, for knowledge, for adaptability in the workforce. Examples of intensive parenting explored in depth by CCL include the phenomenon of tutoring, even tutoring high-achieving children in school, and the incredible anxiety parents have over homework. I wanted to provide this scan of various polls and surveys precisely to illustrate how information must be accurate, clear, consistent, and transparent, and delivered in a manner that overcomes the inclination towards disbelief, which, as I said earlier, seems to be inbuilt to some extent. You might not believe one set of results in terms of performance, but the consistent numbers from disparate sources provide a sense of confidence. And let me reiterate, it is not, I believe, the actual level of performance that counts. Accountability and transparency can catalyze vast and positive educational change in a society if they lead to positive social and solid benchmarks, to targets and models that correspond to the values of that society. You or I may think that more schools deserve an A. We might think that schools cannot do all that parents want them to do. The point is that these surveys show Canadians' perceptions, and perception may be reality unless unbiased information and thorough accountability enable Canadians to reach different conclusions. Just as in any other discipline or sphere of life, trust in learning must be earned. Trust also diminishes when educational institutions are seen as setting goals that are too low. Ben Levin, who served as a respected professor of the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education and as Deputy Minister of Education in Manitoba and Ontario, has recently written, "Public education rests on public confidence. After all, we are asking people to trust us with their children and to give us significant sums of money. Like it or not, schools are in the public communications business. Support can never be taken for granted and must be built and rebuilt continually, hard but very vitally important work." I have noted that many schools seem to fear accountability, even though they can benefit from it. Accountability provides insight into issues such as adequate resourcing, problems with teacher retention, facilitating access, and recognizing successes. Comprehensive analysis about students who drop out, change courses, or change institutions are all valuable in increasing support for schools, and not just in secondary school or elementary school. One of our chief problems in moving post-secondary education forward in Canada is the sparseness of national information. We don't know what happens to students who drop out of programs in our universities and colleges. We don't track that. We have no idea what happens to them. We don't know what happens to the investment that's contained within them. So it's very difficult to move a system forward when we don't have that kind of analysis and that kind of reporting. I think that openness and accountability then are linchpins for mutual understanding, for innovation, for practical improvements, collective responsibility, and improved outcomes for students. I think that strengthening trust in schools is integral to building the partnerships required for making lifelong learning a reality, and that parents, teachers, administrators, business and labor, local associations, social agencies, and individuals must all be partners in the continuum of learning. I think it's precisely because parents and local communities are so concerned about equipping students with the knowledge and skills to adapt to a changing world that they look to schools to teach much more than the traditional subjects. And I mentioned some of those earlier. Teachers are now expected to provide learning and job skills, values and mores, social skills, technological skills, and practical life skills. Parents call for schools to set and meet standards and subjects in all of these areas. Communities want their educational institutions to provide the foundation for lifelong learning. I tend to think that instead of setting a litany of task-specific standards, which the curriculum really can't support, we might want to concentrate on setting broad and durable intellectual standards that may serve students wherever they go and whatever they do in life. These standards might be based on enabling students to develop the capacity for critical thinking rather than memorizing or trying to determine what the teacher wants to hear. In that sense, people who have studied cognition and the different developmental sciences with respect to brain development and physiology, among other things, are concluding that what we really would like is for people to become independent learners by about age 15. Then class size wouldn't make that much of a difference, and we'd move towards individual learning outcomes. I think, by the way, that there exists an implicit link between community-based learning and the skills of critical thinking. And let me turn now to this issue of critical thinking and its development very briefly. If I'm positing that critical thinking and higher intellectual standards go hand in hand, then we need to concentrate on the development of critical thinking based on intellectual values that transcend individual school subject or specific skills. Thinking meaning critical thinking based on clarity, on logic, relevance, precision, consistency, sound evidence, depth, breadth, and fairness. The critical thinking skills deepen the ability to recognize and address problems, marshal vital information, acknowledge assumptions, refine generalizations, and draw warranted conclusions from all of that. Critical thinking is essential to civic participation, understanding, and I'd say navigating our world. Well-cultivated critical thinkers are able to take up the problems of life, raising questions, using abstract ideas to assess information, think with open minds, and communicate effectively. They're self-directed, and self-disciplined, self-monitored, and self-corrective. They demonstrate perseverance, integrity, intellectual humility, and responsibility. And I would say that those are some of the goals that we might want to reach as a society as we think about what education systems might be. The main difficulty, perhaps, main difficulties in achieving critical thinking is there are two. One is this enormous pressure that I've described from parents on school systems and on subject-specific areas that each of which is represented by a large group of interest. And the other is the flow of information. There's so much information, misinformation to young people today through the internet and mass media that it's very difficult for them to assess what is relevant and what's not relevant, what may be true and what may not be true, which leads to a relativistic view of the world in which all opinions are equally valid. And so this is a huge problem that we need to struggle against if we're trying to develop critical thinking. I think we can be helpful there as a society. I think teachers and families can encourage students to be habitually inquisitive, fair-minded in evaluation, willing to reconsider, question experts, and be prudent in making judgments. So let me reach a sort of a peroration here in terms of trying to draw some of these issues together. I've talked about learning as both a social and an individual pursuit. I don't want to leave the social aspect aside because we are talking about trust in education, and I've said that's trust in learning that's beyond the individual. It is a primary object of learning to advance civilization, as we call it, as we think of it. That is, to share purpose and values with those around us is both a central element and an essential application of lifelong learning. Productive, critical, and responsible citizenship with a commitment to action on issues of global importance is part of becoming a complete person. Lifelong learning, then, in this sense, means encouraging both intellectual development and personal involvement in the maintenance of the common good. Thinking, doing, and contributing are all complementary parts of the whole person. Democratic society, then, burgeons among populations whose thinking is well-honed, who are able to question their governments and institutions, and who have a desire to advance through learning. Lifelong learning being the continuous acquisition of new skills, attitudes, and values to adapt and lead the changes occurring in our ever more interdependent world. I guess what I'm saying in short form is that advancing the human condition means reflecting upon the face of learning within our borders and around the world. So returning then to my three central ideas that I set out before you at the beginning, relevant to trust in education. First, I said, accountability and transparency will promote and enhance trust regardless of performance levels at any particular point in time. Therefore, accountability and transparency are in the interest of educators as well as directly in the public interest. Secondly, I said, accountability and transparency do not emerge spontaneously. Society must actively seek to create the conditions, must create the voices, must create the bodies that will help to provide these. The Canadian Council on Learning is only one of those voices. I would argue that Canada needs more of these bodies and agencies at national level, not less. I don't think it's the case that we need to worry about different interpretations of reality. What we need is people interpreting reality and doing it transparently. And thirdly, and perhaps most important, the larger question about trust in education is whether learning is sufficiently well developed in Canada that ours can become a knowledge society. That is, one in which learning extends beyond the narrow boundaries of schools and of formal education. I've said that we need to foster a true social movement with learning at its core. Learning then is much more than a question of money or curriculum. It requires us to challenge ourselves. It requires us to embrace new circumstances. It requires us to recognize the importance of the learning that takes place within so many settings: our schools, our homes, our communities, and our places of work. It requires the development of citizens who are equipped and determined to rise to the tests of their times. I would like to conclude with what I think are fairly stirring words from a man who's occasionally known as the greatest Nova Scotian. Joseph Howe said, "When I sit down in solitude to the labors of my profession, the only questions I ask myself are, what is right, what is just, what is for the public good?" Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a list of 5 questions, but if I'll get permission to email you with 4 of them, and I'll ask only
Fair
them.
enough.
Maybe the most interesting. At one point you were talking about a survey of parents of school-aged children and the various things that they were asking the education to provide in addition to the things that they already teach, like the core subjects of math and science and those things, those boring things. Some of the things were like, values and mores and life skills and work skills and social skills. I think you made a list of them.
Yes.
And I was wondering, where do you think people learned those things before? Why? Is it a new demand of the public education system that we're asking for schools to provide these things? And if it is new, where were children getting these things before?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question. Just before answering that more specifically, there's an enormous contradiction in what we find through the survey work we've done with respect to parental attitudes. And that is that on the one hand, they want the school to be the locus of acquisition of these skills that are important in life for the workplace, but also for navigating the world. On the other hand, they say that the most important thing that the school ought to do is inculcate a love of learning. And that's very encouraging that parents are saying that, which is why they want their kids to be able to play more when they're young instead of sitting at a desk. But parents are having tremendous difficulty reconciling those two things. So they want the kids to love learning, but at the same time, they're really worried about homework. They're really worried about getting their kids ahead. That's why they're providing tutors to kids who are getting A first-class grades at school. The kids who are getting tutoring are not the ones who are failing, it's the ones who are succeeding. But the parents want to get them more. And so that coming to your question then, I think it seems to be that the school is the locus for pressure to learn things that would have been learned in a community environment in the past. You would learn it as an apprentice. You would learn it from the extended family. You learn it from your grandmother. You learn it from your great aunt, from your cousin. In our society, this has become the responsibility of the school, and many of the social issues are laid at the door of the school, I think very unfairly, with the resources that they don't have at their disposal. Even if they had the skills, they still wouldn't have the time and the money. And we certainly can't overload the curriculum. At one point, when I was concentrating on working in medicine, I was a proponent of more health information in the classroom, but of course that's impossible to do because we just don't have the time in the curriculum. Now I'm in favor of what I call health promoting schools, that is creating an environment within the school context which incites people to understand health conditions more. The second thing I want to say is that I think part of the parental view is because they want their kids more to be in control of their own lives. They want them to be able to navigate their world, as I said earlier. We are in an epoch in which, as I said at the beginning, there is much less trust in institutions than before. And so people, understandably, want to protect their children's ability to learn and control their own lives. So if you can understand your own health, for example, you're not entirely dependent on a healthcare system. Parents would see that as an important thing to be able to do. So I think it partly is giving children, as they grow up, the instruments to be in control of their own lives and their own environments, which I think is a laudable expectation. The problem is reconciling that with the tremendous stresses on the school itself. And it's one of the reasons for which I'm so favorable to opening up the education system to a proper interaction with the community. I think schools should be open 16 hours a day, all of them, and they should all be centers for intergenerational learning. And I think it's anathema that we don't do that. It seems so obvious that schools should be the center for community-based learning, but we're still a long way from that. If you get me on that track, then we'll go on for 40 minutes on it.
In the email, maybe.
Yes. Please.
I'd like to follow up on that particular point, actually. There seems to be a relationship between what I wanted to ask and the question you just addressed. You said that early childhood learning was one area in which Canada does rather poorly in comparison to other OECD countries. And I wonder if you could comment on what happened following the 2006 federal election, when I don't know if you would agree, but we seem to be turning away to a certain extent from the idea of state-supported daycare, early childhood education in favor of supporting a return to a more family-oriented kind of education. Obviously, that's just I don't know how significant that is, and keeping in mind Machiavelli's advice not to make new enemies, I wonder if you could comment on the significance of what happened with that.
In our polling, we found that Canadians actually don't favor one particular form of high-quality early childhood development and learning over another. It isn't that they favor a private system over a public system, or daycare over home, or home over daycare. What Canadians are saying is that there aren't enough resources for any of those. And what they really want to know is which models are most effective. Not between the public and the private, or home or daycare, because what they're saying is, what they certainly say to us, is they want choice. They'll make those decisions as parents. What they want is more resources for whatever choice they make. And I think frankly, that's a reasonable expectation. Our problem with what we have now in Canada isn't then between the public and private, or daycare and the home. Our problem is that, like a lot of other things in Canada, we don't have accepted indicators across the country for what represents progress in early childhood learning. I gave a figure in terms of the percentage of Canadian children who aren't ready at age 5 or 6, but that's not sufficient. I'm not giving you sufficient information because I don't have sufficient information. We should be able to monitor our success, as some other societies do, with indicators that are the same across the country. We don't have those. The other thing that's noticeable, though, I have to mention is, because I did say that Canadians don't seem to act on what we know with respect to some of these issues. Since we know, without McCain and Mustard's report, or even with McCain and Mustard's report, how important early childhood is, but we knew that before those various reports in early childhood learning, why we don't act on that. And just an example of how we don't is the fact that early childhood educators are so poorly paid in Canada. In France, they're well paid. They're paid at the same level as people who are teaching in the secondary school system, and they have to be as well qualified. So in that sense, you get what you pay for. And so we haven't been acting on what we think we know. So for me, it's not whether it's public or private, whether it's home or daycare. It's acting on what we know to be a fundamental influence over the long term. And as I said, sometimes you can't tell in the short term what those influences are. I did espouse a theory. I mentioned that the long-term consequences of not having sufficient early childhood learning going on may be felt after school, may be felt in the workplace in all kinds of ways, and not just in terms of actual learning or mastery of academic material. Please.
Dr. Cappon, I've spent almost 2 decades as an instructor in the community college system in Nova Scotia, and what I don't trust about education is credentialism. You didn't mention that in your talk. Maybe you could comment on the seeking of the diploma, the degree, and the certificate without the competency that may go with it, and how does that? How do we get accountability and transparency in that issue?
Well, that gives me the opportunity to advertise the wonderful work of the Prior Learning Assessment Center in Halifax, which on our behalf has done a wonderful job, which is now up on our website, which you might want to look at on the issue of assessment of prior learning in Canada and in other jurisdictions in the developed world. My belief is that we need to allow people to take their place in the workforce and in learning opportunities based on their competencies and not only on their credentials. We can only do that if we have an adequate system and a serious system, an accountable system of understanding what those competencies are. And I think that this country and many regions within the country has not done that job. So we've, as a consequence of that in part, and also because we don't have qualifications frameworks, we've come into this position at which parents and learners themselves feel that credentialism is the only way to move forward. You have to have that piece of paper because there's no other way of ascertaining, or people being able to ascertain as potential employers or lecturers at a university or a college, that you have the skills. I think this is an enormous issue for us, particularly, and not just for us, for European countries as well. Any society that's aging, which is not utilizing to fullest extent the human capital that's present. I say as we age, of course, because we have tremendously large untapped sources of skills, not just Aboriginal Canadians, but others as well. I mentioned the curious problems of males in Canada who have a much higher dropout rate from high school than young women do. A lot of untapped potential there. A lot of people with tremendous learning abilities and tremendous learning that they don't even recognize themselves. And so, and that's not even accounting for the issue of underutilization of skills of immigrants, whose problems are fundamentally, with respect to recognition, not different from those of people who are born in this country. So we don't need a different solution for those folks. And so I think that this is, you've raised a very serious issue. We're just beginning to address it, but we're not addressing it at national level, which I think we need to, because people will have to be mobile, should be mobile as workers and students, and should be able to take advantage of learning opportunities and working opportunities anywhere in the country. Europe is doing it, and I'd like us to do it as well. Please.
I see a problem with male dropout rates in high school, but when it comes to female participation rates in university, I see that as a major increase as opposed to a decrease in the number of males attending. So I just wonder if you could comment on that. And also, I don't see anything necessarily wrong with that increased participation, other than maybe I can't get a date on Friday night. So.
I've noticed that some of the medical schools in Canada are surreptitiously bringing in positive discrimination in favor of males to get some males into the medical schools. They will never advertise that, but I notice that they're doing it. It, of course, is not that it's a problem that almost all of the fields, with just a few exceptions now, are dominated by women. The problem isn't that. The problem is what's happening to the men. If they're not going to university and they're not completing apprenticeships and they're not in greater numbers in community colleges, it's more equal in community colleges than in universities, what's happening to them? So when they drop out of high school, where are they going, and if they're not completing apprenticeships? So I think we should celebrate the fact that more women are in university than before. That's, of course, not the issue for me. The issue with respect to this is what skills are men delivering. The sociological implications of this change will be profound. And I don't think we even begun to think about how we're going to manage those kinds of changes.
And I would just say that if you were to really focus also on increasing female participation in the trades, I think that's especially important as well.
Societies which are really doing well in terms of dropout rates from high school and in terms of skills development among their populations are those populations like Norway, which is my favorite example, in which they have expanded the notion of trades well beyond the sort of traditional male-dominated trades. There are many more women in trades in Scandinavian countries, and they allow people, through partnerships between industry, local industry, and the school system, to do their apprenticeship while they're in high school. And yet, when they graduate from high school with a trade certification in a place like Norway, with only 6 more months in school, they are university qualified. So they can then choose between the trade or university, or can do both, which I think is what we should be driving for.
Doctor, my question refers to 2 of the 4 pillars of learning, learning to live together and learning to be. Both of these pillars relate to interaction with community. And I'm wondering if you see it as the role of the provincial ministries to encourage young Canadians to be more active in community, which in turn will lead to strengthening community. And are any of the provincial ministries working to this end?
be more active in the community. Well, some provinces definitely are. They've mandated community service for high school students. And I think that's important. I think that will probably grow in importance as people take up the Composite Learning Index that we have, because when you look at the weighting of things like volunteering as a source of learning, or the effect it has on community learning conditions, it's quite profound. Its importance is quite profound. So as that understanding takes root, I think in various communities there'll be more emphasis put on that aspect of learning. Whether that should be legislated or not, mandated in an official way by school boards or by ministries of education, I don't know. I see this more as a cultural shift and more to do with this sort of social movement I see learning to be, rather than a particular position about what a provincial government should do at any particular point in time.
Obviously, the big challenge is to work the curriculum, which is mandated,
Yes.
with the volunteerism, and to give them opportunity to have more time to do these things.
And, you know, one of the things we have to do better, because our council has been involved with doing so much other work, we haven't got around to this yet, but we have to assess the results of community service, of learning by community service. We haven't even begun to do that yet. It's like a lot of other things we do. If an organization like CCL can assess those results, that will give more impetus to that. My view is that the numbers will speak, but we have to get around to doing that analysis, and it's on our list.
Good.
I would like to say.
Doctor, thank you very much for your remarks. I just had one question. You used a phrase early on that intrigued me. It was called the learning ethic, and I think you only used it once. Could you put some flesh on the bones for me and give me perhaps a more broader definition of what you take to be the learning ethic, and whether through your own learning your concept of what that is or ought to be has evolved?
Learning ethic, of course, when I use the term, I mean an attachment to the process of learning, to the values of learning, and to the outcomes of learning. I think Canada is probably fairly well placed with respect to that, because as a frontier society early on, I think educators had a fairly distinguished role within it. Teachers were, relatively speaking, important parts of the community. They were seen as leaders in the community. There was a real respect for the role. These were pioneer communities. People came to the country, and still do, because they thought there was advantage to having not just land and opportunity, but also better education. It's not an accident that some of the people who built, as entrepreneurs, the industrial system of the country came from Scotland, which had the most highly developed educational system in Europe in the late 18th century and early 19th century. And that educational ethic came with them. That wasn't the only national grouping that that had that. But I think Canada was infused then with this feeling about the importance of education, the role of the teacher. I think there has been, over the last 20 years, an unfortunate decline in the prestige of the teacher in the community because of various reasons. But I think the notion of the education ethic as a central virtue, a central value, is still there. And that's why I think it's something that unites Canadians. And I can say this even as somebody who's also trained in medicine. I think it unites Canadians a lot more than the notion of a national healthcare system, for example, because it transcends all ideologies and all social classes, and is really fundamental, I think, to the Canadian character.
Dr. Cappon, I was really pleased to hear you talk about critical thinking in your presentation. I've had the opportunity to be in secondary school both in Canada and in Europe, and sadly, my critical thinking skills were probably improved more in 1 year in Europe than 3 years in secondary school in Canada, so I think that's a huge problem as well. My question is, what do we do to sort of ensure that we're graduating out of high school, adequate critical thinkers here in Canada? Because I think that's a skill that every human being should have, regardless of whatever their occupation is. Yeah. Thanks.
As you might have inferred from what I said earlier, of course, I don't think this is an issue that begins in the school. I think it's an issue that begins at home. And it's why I refer to learning as a social movement, another metaphor that I use sometimes is a three-legged stool. You'll notice that if you take a three-legged stool and each of the legs of the stool is of equal length, it'll balance on any surface. But a normal chair won't, with four legs. My three-legged stool are the community, the home, and the school. They have to be of equal length. If one is longer than the other, and often in our society it's a school, they won't balance. When you think about early childhood learning, to which we were referring earlier, we know from our research that one of the main influences is the family early on. Do parents read to the children? Do parents later on in life, do you have discussions around the dining room table? One of the advantages of the research we were just talking about earlier around standardized testing, international standardized testing, was the shocking result for some of us that parental influences like reading to children were almost as important as social class and income in determining learning outcomes. And therefore the results that kids would have in different countries on the standardized tests that they would undergo in mathematics or sciences or reading. So I think that it begins not in school, but it begins in the family, and therefore obviously a healthy family environment in whatever way the family is constituted is going to be extremely important in terms of developing critical thinking. Those skills are developed by parental models or family models or adult models modeling questions, modeling discussions, not opinion but discourse, which we don't do a lot of. In other words, around the table, instead of telling your kid what to think or ask what homework she's done, ask a question. What do you think about this? What's your evidence? Where did you find out? How did you assess the evidence? You can do that even at age 6. We're militating when we do that against, now here I'm putting on my sociologist hat, that's what I did my doctorate in. We're militating, as I said earlier, against this tremendous stress of flow of information and misinformation from the internet and all kinds of other sources, in which it's so difficult for young people or even older people to evaluate truth, and therefore everything becomes relative. Your opinion is just as good as my opinion, even if you don't know anything about it, or vice versa. How is it possible to develop critical skills there? And the answer, it seems to me, has to be you determine as a parent or as a model for a child growing up that sort of questioning in a critical way, in a rational way, in a way that demands evidence. And you just carry that on in the school system. That's the role of teachers. The role of teachers for me is to model that sort of behavior in a way that parents should have begun. So there's no short answer. It's not just a matter of teaching logic, although that should be taught in schools, I would argue, but it's not a matter of a formal course in logic. It's a matter of treating this the way I would treat the issue of health in schools, as I mentioned before. I want a health-promoting school. I don't want to take up class time with teaching health issues in an overburdened curriculum. And so I argue the same way about critical thinking. It needs to be part of the culture early on, defended and promoted by parents and the community, which is another reason for arguing for community-based learning facilities where generations are in interaction and you're learning together. And there's a lot more propensity then to come around to a view about being critical about what you're hearing and doing.
I just want to come back to the question of trust in the education systems. And you touched on a couple of points, and I think many of us have seen reports that would support this, which is a general trend in that those that have much education or much success in education have even more. You cited the workplace learning and the gap between those at a high school level and those that have a diploma or degree. We've seen that in continuing education. You mentioned honor students also getting some sort of support as well. That trend, which we have seen over a period of time in a number of ways in the education structure, what I'd like to get your comment on, does it lead to a polarization that erodes trust by its very nature? In other words, we have a system that on one hand works well, depending upon the lens you use, part rates, etc., and for those for whom it works very well. And for those for whom it doesn't work, it can fail abysmally. And I'm wondering if just the sheer gap that we've seen, if that in and of itself erodes public trust because of the way we view societal constructs and some sort of equity in terms of access and perhaps experience as well. But I'd just like to get your comment on that specific point.
It's interesting that when we did our survey on Canadians' attitudes towards education, or schools at least, the school portion of it, it wasn't necessarily the case that the people who had their children in private schools or had tutors mistrusted the education system. They didn't tend to give a lower grade to the education system than parents whose kids were not doing well. It was a slightly lower score, but not remarkably lower score. It was more that they were concerned that their kids have every advantage. That's why you have a first-class student in tutoring for physics or mathematics. Not because you think the system is failing. But I think it's true that the inevitable result of that is a dichotomy, a dichotomization of the educational system. Eventually it breaks apart. Of course it does. And the people who are able to afford the tutoring and take advantage of it will get the better job opportunities, and that there will be all kinds of repercussions that way. I think also that the issue of stake in public education is very important in relation to this. If we can't find a way to ensure that the broader public whose kids are no longer in school, talking about elementary and secondary school, see that they have a stake in public education, we're going to dichotomize even further. It'll break apart even further, and we won't be able to preserve the strength of public education that we had traditionally. And of course, as the population ages and our kids are out of school and they're on to other things, what is our stake in public education? Why should we care? Why should we pay taxes for it? We have to see that there's a community stake in it, not just a personal stake as represented by our children once we're off the school council or whatever it is. So I think, yes, I think there are two issues here. I think there's the stake that we all have in public education, but I also think that the stress that parents are under to allow their kids to perform better so that they can have better career chances tends to set us up into a distinctive two-tier system, and that is a threat. Nothing should be done about it, I would argue, because it's a natural reaction. You want to do the best for your own children. I recall an interview I saw with the Minister of Education in England a few years ago. She was a Labour Minister of Education, and she was being raked over the coals by BBC because she put her children into private schools. And it was a tremendously hot issue in England, but she was not in the least apologetic. As Minister of Education, I have to do what's best for English students. As a mother, I'm going to do what's best for my children, she said. And that was not an incorrect answer. I thought it would be unfair to rake her over the coals for that. So that is the kind of contradiction I think we're in. And I would argue that we only move out of it by doing better for all of the kids in the system, quite frankly, and not just those that can afford the tutoring.
Thank you very much for your talk tonight. I have one question then. Again, it's about really how learning has begun at home. But 50 years ago, there would have been a third partner more often than not in that equation called the church. So how has your research addressed issues of trust and ethics in education when delivered within private religious schools, or what were called separate schools? And 50 years ago, that would have been more or less monolithic Christianity as it has been perpetrated in Canada. And how does your research encompass the discussion now in a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith environment?
Outside the school system, I mentioned that we have in our Composite Learning Index with respect to the multi-ethnic environment, we have one measure, one of the many measures that accounts for learning among cultures. And we're able to look at each community in Canada with respect to how much learning occurs because of that intercultural interaction that we have. And so we see that as a positive thing with respect to learning broadly. That's beyond the classroom. With respect to learning in the classroom, we haven't broken it down as between private religious denomination school and public school, or even other kinds of private schools. But what we seem to understand by standardized testing, this is not CCL's testing, this is others' testing, but we do report on this. What we seem to understand is that education results don't differ very much between public and private schools. I'm not sure whether we're talking about religious school, any kind of private school. I haven't, as I said, distinguished between private religious and private non-religious. There are differences in performances between those types of schools, but they're not to do with the school. They're to do with the parental background, the social class of the parents. That accounts for almost all of the differences in results between the private and the public. If you strip away the social class of the parents, there are no differences in outcomes. That's very encouraging for the public school system, by the way. And a final point I'd like to make, I'm not sure if you're alluding to this or not, but there is a sense, this is my own view now, it's not substantiated by analysis and data, but there is a sense that some of the religious denominated schools have the advantage, at least, of understanding the issue of relativism, or the challenge of relativism in modern society that I was referring to before, whereby it's very difficult for people, especially young people, to discern whether something might have more validity or less validity. This is an issue, this issue of relativism, that you hear people like the Pope talking about all the time as a fundamental issue of our time. I think in some of the religious denominated schools, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I won't argue, but they have a stronger concept of what seems to be true, at least true in their own perception of reality. And that might help them a little bit to filter out some of the information that they might consider to be irrelevant. It might help them to focus a little more on what they think is fundamental. As I say, I'm not arguing pro or con that kind of school. I'm just saying that a lot of the parents whose children are in those schools understand that this challenge of relativism and of filtering out certain information might be important to them. So they might have something of an advantage there.
I think probably now is as good a time as any to wrap things up, so I'm going to call on Doug Hall to bring things to a conclusion. Thank you. Thank you for your participation. It's been outstanding.
Thanks, Alan. And thank you, Paul, for the excellent presentation. It was a compelling case, I thought, for lifelong learning, and I jotted down a couple of the key words as you were talking that I guess because I particularly like them maybe, accountability, transparency, and work-based skills training, which are subjects that we need to work on a lot more in this province and in this country. The passion for learning is at the heart of the mission for the Learning Partnership, which is co-hosting this event tonight. You may know the Learning Partnership, or you may not know the Learning Partnership, but it is the sponsor of Welcome to Kindergarten, Welcome to School, as it's called here in Nova Scotia, and also Take Your Kids to Work, which has been around for 15 years at least. I have the pleasure to be on the board of directors of the Learning Partnership, a national not-for-profit organization, which is the only one in Canada that tries to bring together business, labor, education, government, policymakers, and the community at large to partnership in trying to encourage the best we can have in public education in Canada. It's a tall order, and we try as hard as we can. One of the ways that we do that is through significant partnerships like the one we're having tonight. I'd like to thank the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, which was co-founded by St. Mary's University and the Atlantic School of Theology, for putting on this seminar and allowing us to participate with it. And also thank St. Mary's for the facilities that you're in. To Dr. Paul Cappon for his thought-provoking presentation. And to the audience, very, very interesting questions for those of you that had the chance to get to the microphone, so thank you for that. Sheila mentioned before, don't forget, write down March the 11th. You now can turn your phones, Blackberries back on and put that down, which will be here as well with Sir John Daniel speaking. There's a reception just outside, as you would have heard earlier, so please stay and chat. I think you're able to stay, and we'll discuss some things. And just before we leave, we have a small token of appreciation to you, Doctor, for your efforts. Thank you very much.